I'm Scott Sullivan, Discipleship Catalyst with the Georgia Baptist Mission Board, and our team exists to strengthen Georgia Baptist churches in the area of discipleship. We've developed 3 tools just for you. The WATERSHED principle, which identifies the 6 main ministries of the church that must be healthy to produce world-impacting disciple makers. The Spark Conference. Last year's conference saw over 33,000 views from 45 different states and 18 countries. This year's conference will premiere on August the 12th with best-selling author Tony Evans, Ben Mandrell, president of Lifeway, and David Kinnaman, the president of the Barna Group. We also have learning communities that are set up throughout Georgia, which exist to help you finish the task of leading your family in ministry well. You can see our website to find one near you. Also, every Thursday at 3 p.m., you can catch this broadcast through Facebook, Instagram, or multiple podcast platforms. Now, let's join today's broadcast. Welcome, friends. I've been looking forward to this discussion on the small church with Karl Vaters and PJ Dunn for weeks. And this is one of those broadcasts that can, and I pray will, stir us to do better in at making disciples, and particularly in the small church context. This is so insightful. I hope that you will tune in, and I hope that you will share this with your friends, because you're going to see in just a moment that this is 90% of us are dealing with the concepts and parameters that when we talk about the small church. Now, let me give you a reminder that we are a product of you giving to the cooperative program. So thank you for giving generously to CP. And our team has a pile of resources that we want to give away. So please leave a comment. Let us know where you're watching from. And by doing that, you will get entered into a drawing at the end of the broadcast. Now, let me introduce our guest first, Karl Vaters. He's the author of the book we're talking about today, Small Church Essentials. He's the founder of newsmallchurch.com, and it's a ministry that encourages, connects, and equips innovative small church pastors. So his heart is to help pastors of small churches, of what he says is up to 90% of us, find resources to lead well and capitalize on the unique advantages of pastoring in that small church. Karl's been a pastor of ministry for over 30 years. He's the teaching pastor at Cornerstone Christian Fellowship, which is a healthy church, small church in Orange County, California. And he's been ministering there for over 25 years with his bride, Shelley. He's got a couple of books, Small Church Essentials, also The Grasshopper Myth. Also, we're going to have PJ Dunn. But Karl, man, we are glad that you're with us, buddy.
Thank you, Scott. It's good to be with you. And actually, I hadn't brought you guys up to speed. We have recently changed our website over. I'm no longer at newsmallchurch.com, but they made me rename it karlvaters.com. So as long as you can remember how to spell my name, you can find me.
Hey, that's great. And we will put that into the chats. Particularly if you're watching Facebook, on Georgia Baptist Discipleship on Facebook, we'll put that in there so folks can find it. And we also have today PJ Dunn. Dr. Dunn is the president of Table for One Ministries, what I call the top singles ministry resource in the nation. And he's the discipleship consultant for our team down in Southwest Georgia, and just crushing it. So grateful for him. He's an all-around great guy and discipleship guru. PJ, thank you for being on and for producing this as well.
Happy to be here. I just want to know how Karl's going to sign my book. How do we do that with COVID restrictions?
Digital signature.
Consider it signed.
DocuSign. There we go.
Yeah, there we go.
That's a new form of digital signature right there. There we go.
I know. I haven't had somebody walk to me with a Kindle and ask me to sign their Kindle yet. So
yeah, that'd be awkward.
Yeah.
Hey, let me share a few stats as we jump into this discussion, because in preparation for this, I asked Tom Kreitz, who is on our research and development team here, to just research some small church statistics, some things that our viewers, listeners may not know. Interesting. 88% of the Georgia Baptist Convention churches average less than 250 in worship. Not a new statistic. That's about the same as it's been as I've tracked that over the last 10 years. But that means that 3,100 of our 3,600 churches run less than 250. Just kind of puts that in perspective. Now, when we think about bivocational churches or churches that do not have a full-time pastor, I want you to listen closely here, because this statistic I'm about to share in a moment is staggering for me. I did not know this, and it caught me off guard. So 33% of our Georgia Baptist churches have a bivocational or part-time pastor. 52% have a full-time pastor, and 15% have an interim pastor or don't have a pastor at all. Here's what that means. Nearly 48%, almost half of our 3,600 Georgia Baptist churches do not have a full-time pastor. So a lot of the things that we're talking about and resources that we're developing, when we develop those for churches who don't have a full-time pastor, we're creating sometimes resources that can't be used by a large group of people. So just keep in mind, when we think about single staff churches, we found an estimated of 61% of our churches only had one paid staff member, 31% had 2 to 4, and 8%, only 8% of churches have more than 4 paid staff members at their church. And then some of you may have known this, but just by way of information, our churches average 140 in worship, and the median Georgia Baptist church averages 65 in attendance. So just incredible perspective, Karl. But what it says to our team is that the numbers relate to what you're talking about in your book, Small Church Essentials, and just how critical it is that we do well with learning how to minister and maximize the benefit of that smaller normative size church. So let me ask you a question here. What was your passion behind creating this book? And I know you've been in a small church and you like that and you prefer that and you've got serious thoughts on it. So what was your passion behind creating this? But also give us a definition of really what is a small church and why you chose that definition.
Well, there's about an hour and a half worth of content I could unpack answering those questions, but I'll try to be brief. My passion for small church began because I tried to build a big church and failed.
Come on.
I have come to prefer small churches, but it's been something that I've only realized that I prefer in recent years. For you, I graduated right. I didn't realize it at the time, but I graduated from Bible college right in between 2 generations. When I went to Bible college, several of my books I borrowed from my father from when he went to Bible college, and I used them in my classes. 5 years later, nobody in those classes was using any of the brand new books I had bought 5 years before. Everything shifted. It was when the church growth movement really hit strongly and brought a lot of really, really good things with it. But I found myself 5 to 10 years out of Bible college and new in pastoring, realizing I had to unlearn some things and relearn everything based on a lot of the new things that were happening in the church growth movement. So I did that and learned a lot and gained a lot of value out of it. But when I applied those principles, while they often brought a lot of more mission-mindedness and greater health and even a greater leadership base in the church, the numerical growth, which everybody pointed to as the sign that this is working, the numerical growth didn't occur. We had some numerical growth. We went from a church in the 20s to 30s to a church in the 70s, and eventually we ended up at around 150 or so. But this dreaded 200 barrier that I keep hearing about, I could never break through. And I brought in experts. I live in Southern California, 8 miles south of Disneyland. A 45-minute drive from the Fuller Church Growth Institute. 45-minute drive from Saddleback, from all these places that are producing all of this church growth stuff. And so I have expertise around, and I brought them in. I'm not afraid to have, people help me out. And everybody who came in said, "Oh, your church won't be small for long," which the first couple of times you hear it sounds great. But the 20th time, like, okay, what's wrong with me? And then I almost left ministry in real frustration and discouragement because I thought I must be doing something wrong, because the numerical growth that everybody seems to say is inevitable if you're doing it well did not happen for us. And so I thought the lack of numerical growth was telling me I'm doing something wrong. And a long story short, through a season where I almost left ministry, the Lord really helped me to see that, in fact, it was not a sign that I was doing something wrong, that it's kind of like church growth is still in its infancy. We're still only 40 years or so into church growth. And when you take a look at, for instance, scientists, when they come up with a scientific theory, scientists come up with a theory and they go, hey, what if this here should result in this? But then you know what they do? They actually do experiments to see if their theory works. So the theory of church growth is, if I'm doing these things to make my church healthy, the theory is that that should result in a larger congregation because people will come to Christ. That means more people will be in the church. Theoretically, that makes sense. But when we test it out in the real world, that doesn't happen for most congregations. It simply doesn't. The experiment doesn't prove that theory to be true. Now, again, it can bring a lot of health and all kinds of other good things it did for us. So out of that, I started looking around and going, there must be something else going on. And as I started recognizing that not only the congregation that I was pastoring, but many congregations I was looking at were staying small, even though they were doing great missional work, I started realizing we've got to look at this through a new lens. And I started asking myself, what does a healthy small church look like? And I couldn't find the help I was looking for, at least not all put together in a book. If I'd been able to find my book, I never would have written my book. Right? I only wrote it because I saw this big gap. So that's how I ended up in this. So the second question then is, what is a small church? Which is a really important question. My definition of a small church has changed over the years. In my first book, The Grasshopper Myth, I simply took what I read in church growth manuals and plugged it into my book. And so they said anything under 350 is a small church. So that's what my first book says. By the time I wrote my second book, I'd been talking with a lot of small church pastors in a lot of places other than Orange County, and started realizing, no, I got to drop that number. I dropped it to 250 on the cover. And then as I started having continued conversations, I realized I'm still not there yet. So here's my current definition of a small church. And I just wrote this on my blog at karlvaters.com. So if you go back there, if you go there and you just put in my search engine, what is a small church, you'll see this article. Here's how I define small church. There are two very specific types of small churches. There's the church of 50, give or take 50. And there's the church of 150, give or take 50. Those are two very different types of churches, but they have more in common than they have different. So if you're in a congregation of 20 and you just heard me say 150, give or take 50, which still includes 200, that may be bigger than the biggest church in your town. And I get that. And the difference between a church of 20 and a church of 200 is big. But here's the deal. You and a church of 20 have more in common with a pastor of a church of 200 than that pastor of a church of 200 has in common with the pastor of a church of 500.
Interesting.
Because under 200, you can know everybody in the church. You can minister somewhat personally, or in 20 very personally, but over that, the way we pastor changes completely. So that is my current running definition, and I'll upgrade it and make it better when I learn more.
And I like that, Karl. I like that definition. And here's why, because my experience in the small church was hitting that 150 to 250 range. Things began to change the dynamics of what we were doing in the church for it to get to 300, 350, 500. We started having to think a little bit differently, and the structure of plugging people in and how we were making disciples began to shift. So I think there is an element there with what you're talking about, that as you get above that, it changes. So I think a definition, that includes that 250 and below, I think it's right on target.
Thank you. Yeah, it helps, but and it also helps when I define it that way for those who are in the 50, give or take, to see that there is a difference between their situation and if you're in 150, give or take, because there are some differences, but the commonalities are far more than the differences are.
And it's interesting when we really ask pastors and we hear pastors, we learn more every time. So we've never landed and arrived at the final answer. And so I love your openness to saying, hey, I'm continuing to learn. I didn't just write a book and made my book the answer. That I'm evolving, I'm listening, and I've had to do that here moving to Southwest Georgia. I moved from the Metroplex of DFW. And so when you move from there, a small church there is, man, you only run 1,000, and I mean, that's people look almost down at churches running 1,000 in DFW. And the numbers you're talking about are very common here in Southwest Georgia. And it's, but there's just different dynamics and different and things, but good church is good church. And I really want to know your thoughts on discipleship, specifically while we just, have you for a few moments. You talk about a lot of principles in your book, which is really, really helpful. It's kind of like a toolkit that you can go in and you can pick up little nuggets along the way. And so, tell us what your principle for discipleship in a small church environment would be? And then how do you engage volunteers in that process? Because it's a very different answer for the church size we're talking about as opposed to a church of 5 or 1,000.
Yeah, it is. It is. The answer for discipleship in any size church really goes back to the discipleship method that Jesus used, the Apostle Paul used, that all of the early disciples used, which is mentoring. In a lot of our churches, we are curriculum based. And I don't have a problem with curriculum. We'll talk about how to use it in a moment. But I think in some of our churches, we have become so dependent on curriculum that we think we're discipling people when all we're doing is getting them to finish classes.
Yeah.
And finishing a class and being discipled are not the same thing. There's some overlap, but if all they're doing is finishing classes, they're not being discipled. At the core of discipleship is mentoring. If it is not built around a relationship with a more mature believer, you are not being discipled. Now, in a small church, the pastor is typically more hands-on in the discipleship process. It doesn't mean that you've got to have constant cups of coffee with every individual in the congregation. You can still do it in smaller groups, and you should, and I constantly am training disciples who then become disciple makers, so that now I'm 28, almost 29 years in my current congregation. And so now most of the discipleship that's done in our congregation is not done by me. It's done by people that I discipled, or now it's being done by people who were discipled by people I discipled. After 28 years, you're third, fourth generation down the line, but we've been working on this for a couple of decades of creating disciples who become disciple makers. It's slower than graduating people from a class. And that may be one of the reasons why we don't do it as much. It's just easier to get people to finish a class, buy a curriculum, get the class done. But it doesn't do the discipleship part of it. Now, curriculum is very helpful, but curriculum is helpful for two things. One, to make sure that people are staying between the theological guardrails, right? Because one of the concerns that pastors often have is, I can't disciple other people to disciple them. Then I'm not involved anymore. And how do I know if they're going to be teaching them heresy or whatever? Well, first of all, if you discipled them well, you shouldn't have to worry about that. Secondly, if you give them curriculum you trust and say, use this curriculum in your relationship. So when you sit down and you have that conversation over coffee, or when you put together that book club, give them a book so that 3 or 4 of them who are discipling each other, you give them the theological guardrails by giving them curriculum. And then secondly, curriculum keeps them on a time pace so that they don't end up running down rabbit trails and not completing the thing. Yeah. So it gives us a pace, and it gives us theological guardrails, but it should always be done within the process of relationship. And one of the great pieces of news about newer generations, I know it's really popular for people of my generation to tell people of the next generation that they're doing it all wrong. The fact of the matter is they're not. And one of the great appeals to newer generations is the idea of mentoring. Boomers love curriculum and classes. Millennials and Gen Z, they like somebody taking them under their wing and having a closer, actual, authentic relationship with them and developing trust in that relationship. That is actually going to be much more appealing in the next generation or so of churches.
Yeah, that's really strong, Karl, because when I think about the mentoring part of that, I think the struggle that a lot of them have is they've never seen that, and they've never been modeled for them. And a lot of the Gen X, we just don't know what we don't know. So like, we were never mentored. But what I have found, I'd love for you to speak into this just for a second. What I've found in the Gen X and those below, once they experience it, they got it. And they don't want to go back to a less intimate, less effective model.
Yeah, absolutely true. So some of that is the shift that's happened in our culture over these generations. The boomer generation, and quite frankly, the generation before us, the builders, came out of World War II and basically built the entire infrastructure that we see around us, from roads to electrical lines to plumbing, you name it. It was, before World War II, it was unusual if you had a toilet in the house. Before World War I, it was unusual if you had a toilet in the house. After World War II, it was unusual if you didn't. Right. It all happened really, really quickly. So they built this infrastructure, and they did it within a culture in which they trusted each other. So they had relationships, but they needed structures. And as they were building the structures, we forgot about the relationships. And so we handed our kids a society in which they've got all the stuff, but they are the first generation to grow up in a culture of divorce and abandonment and neglect. And so what they're hungry for more than anything else is relationships that with people that they can trust. And there's no better place to be discipled in relationship with people that you trust than in a healthy small congregation. It's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about it.
That's good. PJ, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I'm my goodness, you should do this for a living. So that was really good. I'm just, I think when people get intimidated about discipleship in their smaller churches, they talk about volunteers. And so I really want to, it's very discouraging sometimes when you're in that 50-person church and you say, okay, who will raise their hand, and nobody raises their hand to volunteer. Nobody does. And so somebody's watching and they're saying, that sounds great, Karl, but you haven't met Tommy. And I know Tommy, and he's been in the church for 30 years. Tommy served 10 years ago, but he hasn't served since because he's done his time. How do you get Tommy to be part of a disciple-making process and volunteer and maybe get re-involved in that smaller environment where that pool isn't as big, to just go find another volunteer?
Yeah. This is one of the big differences in teaching from a big church perspective and teaching from a small church perspective is through no fault of their own, simply because it's their life experience. The people who have come out of a big church make certain assumptions about things that we in small churches can't make. And you've just hinted at that, PJ. So in a big church, they'll just say, here's how you find the right volunteer and here's how you train them. And then the small church pastor is doing exactly what you're doing. Was okay, but where do I get that first one? So my first piece of advice is start with one. When I first came to my congregation 28 years ago, there were 30, on a big Sunday, there were 30 people. On an average Sunday, there were 12 people. They were all very discouraged. They'd been through 5 pastors in the previous 10 years. But there was one young guy who was overseeing what was left of the splintered youth group. And I recognized in him, 1, a passion, 2, a naivete. He didn't know how broken the church was. He was too young to understand that. And 3, he had the time to sit down with me. So the passion, basically the 2 things were the passion and the passion, the willingness, and the availability were the 3 things really. And so I just sat down with him every week. He was so young at the time. I had coffee, and he had chocolate milk. It's true. And every week we just sat down with him and I just talked with him and hey, let's do, I'd put him up to preach on a Sunday and he would completely fall flat on his face. So the next week we'd get together and go, okay, fine. The next time you do it. And he went, next time? I went, yeah. Here's how you do it better next time. And I just went, he was the only one I had. So I did that to him. Very long story, very short. 3 years ago, he's still in the church. He's been my youth pastor the entire time I've been here. And like I say, I'm about to celebrate 29 years here. 3.5 years ago, he became my pastor.
Wow.
And I am his teaching pastor. So he is now the lead pastor. He is now my boss. And now a whole bunch of people have come and gone. We've had a whole bunch of false starts where we've gone to somebody and you think it's going to go and then they just collapse. They don't follow through. I understand that. But we just kept going at it. Another example, we had one Sunday, a dozen years ago or so, there were 3 people walking ahead of me into church on a Sunday morning. And I noticed there was a piece of garbage. It was actually like a styrofoam coffee cup that somebody had stepped on by the door. The first person didn't notice it. The second person kicked it aside like they were upset. And the third person, a teenager, saw it, went over, picked it up, dropped it in the garbage, and kept walking with his friends. So after church, I went to the third kid and I went, hey, come here. I want to talk to you. You're not in trouble. Right? If you summon over a teenager as a pastor during Sunday, tell them right away they're not in trouble. Don't make them wait unless they are in trouble. You're not in trouble. So I said, I told him what I saw and he was so naive. He went, was I not supposed to do that, Pastor? I said, no. It's fine. I said, I think you may be a leader in the church. He was like, because I picked up a piece of garbage? I said, yeah, because you picked up a piece of garbage. Yes. I said, so here's what I want you to do. You know how you help set up the chairs on Sunday morning? He said, yeah. I said, can you have a friend to help you next week? I said, that's all. Yeah, just recruit a friend to help you. Okay. The next week, he had 3 friends helping him. And I looked at it and went, oh, I've got me a leader here.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But here's what I did was I looked for someone who had a servant's heart. If you start with a leader and try to turn them into servants, I've never known it to end well ever. It's much easier to turn a servant into a leader than it is to turn a leader into a servant. Yeah. So your illustration earlier on about Tommy, who's been around for a while, you may not, I wouldn't go to Tommy right away. I would go to the kid who has the kid, or even the younger person, or somebody who's older, who's brand new to the faith, or somebody who's barely trying to figure out what this Christian thing is. Someone who's got the passion, the availability, and quite frankly, their naivete at the beginning might actually be a benefit. The fact that they don't know enough scripture, the fact that they don't know how toxic and sick and how bad the church's history is might be a benefit. So you want to find the least formed lump of clay that you can, but someone who's got a servant's heart. And here's the deal. If, like with this one kid, if that next Sunday he had just been stacking chairs by himself, and every week I reminded him, and for 4 weeks in a row he never had anybody help him, I'd look at it and go, okay, so I don't have a leader, but I've got a great servant. So I'll continue to nurture his servant's heart. If you start with a servant, you never lose, because at least you have a good servant. But if out of that they demonstrate leadership capabilities, then you spend time with them, and then you start encouraging their leadership and their discipleship. So you want to start with one. You want to start with those who are passionate and available. You may have to, in a small church, you may have to sidestep the people who are officially in roles or have been around for a while. And they may still continue to serve with titles, but you may actually get the job done by people without titles for a while. And then what will happen is the people with titles will notice it, and either will get on with the program, or will decide this isn't for them. Or the third, of course, will push back against it. But it's kind of hard to push back against someone who's just willing to stack chairs every week and is really coming at it with a servant's heart.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's helpful practical advice, Karl. So let me ask a follow-up that deals with another piece of helpful practical advice, because in your book, you talk about redesigning the order of worship service in a way that invigorates the small church towards being open to change. Do you have a couple of examples of how that can happen, and where would a pastor start?
Yeah. The premise for it is a lot of churches may be doing something really well, but they've got it buried beneath so many layers that by the time when people first come, they don't have the chance to see the thing the church is doing really well. So you want to put your best foot out front. You want to put the thing you do best first, so that people see it right up front. And one example of that is the order of service. So if I were to go back to this church at the beginning, when I first showed up, there was one guy who was leading in worship, and he was the only guy who knew how to play or was willing to do so. And he got up every Sunday. He told me at first, I don't like doing this. I don't want to do this, but I'm doing it because somebody has to lead in worship. And every Sunday he got up and ruined church for me for the first 20 minutes. So by the time I got up to preach, I was digging myself out of a hole that this guy had dug. And I couldn't blame him, because he told me up front he didn't like it and he wasn't good at it and didn't want to do it. I couldn't blame him for that. Yeah. I blame myself, because I looked at it and went, okay, maybe if somebody's in that position, maybe that shouldn't be the first thing that people see and hear when they walk in. Right. And I also noticed that at the end of the service, when he came back for a song, that last song always had a better reception and always had a better response, because people were responding to what they'd heard from the word that morning. So if I were to go back, one of the first things I would do is I would take a look at it and go, what is our best way to order the service so that we're doing our best thing up front? And at that time, the best thing was my sermons. It wasn't because I'm a great preacher, because it was the least bad thing we did. I would tell people, starting next week, first thing is going to be the sermon. And then maybe after the sermon, we receive the offering, then maybe the announcements, then maybe a closing song or two. It depends on how you want to do that. Now, the challenge for that, of course, if you're in a church where the order of service has not been changed in 30 years, and we low church folk, as opposed to some of our, friends in the Lutheran and Methodist and Catholic churches and so on. That's called high church. We're called low church. I don't know why they get high and we get low, but that's just the way the terms are. We think we don't have liturgy. We do. We just don't call it that. And our liturgy typically is our order of service, right? And all three of us could probably, in 30 seconds, lay out a typical order of service for one of our typical churches. And 90% of the pastors watching right now would go, oh, yeah, that's us, right? Yeah. It's not written down anywhere. It's not, quote unquote, required officially. But boy, you mess with that, people are going to go, are we even Baptist anymore? How did that, one of the first things I did when I first came to the church was I took out the special number, right? The special song during the service, during the offering. Why? Because the only guy who knew how to sing a solo was the guy who had already led us in 4 bad worship songs. So I went, let's not, at least I had the wisdom to stop doing that. So take a look around and ask yourself, okay, what do we do best? And what would be a good way to change the order of service to reflect that so that people have the best chance to respond to the word in a way that works best for us? And now, do not present that as this is going to fix all of our problems. I talked to one pastor recently who read my book, and he said, I did that. And the response from the board was, really? That's how you're going to fix the church? I thought it would fix everything. It's like, no, that's not, no. That is a very minor point, but it's an example of how we can start rethinking about things that we don't realize are so ingrained within our church culture.
Well, and one reason we love having authors on is that sometimes you have tone and the text doesn't have tone. Like, I almost think we should write these things with emojis and like little video snippets, because you read and it's hollow and you read into it what you're thinking. And so your example is true. When we read books, sometimes we're like, well, that's what he said to fix halfway through, so I'm going to try that. But I love the idea of put your best foot forward, whatever that is. And what we do well is this, and we're going to do that. I was, when I came on board, Scott, he said, you're going to preach a lot of Sundays, fill in the pulpits. And I was like, man, that's fantastic. Let's do that. What he didn't tell me is that a church would ask me to sing worship one morning. And when I got asked that question, would you sing worship on a Sunday morning? I said, with all respect, that would ruin everything else that comes out of my mouth. And so the answer is no. And we can just not do worship. It's okay. We can hum. We can do something else, but I ain't leading us in worship. And somebody said amen in the chat right now because they've heard me. But you can't fake everything. And so I love the idea of just thinking out of the box for that. And we want to close with this idea. I really want to hear both of you. Carl, you go first, and Scott kind of wrap us up with this. But we often talk about being a healthy church, and these definitions matter, right? And we're talking about what a healthy church is in your book, but I mean, a lot of churches throw around that word. What is healthy? And even on this broadcast, we use that a lot. So how would you define a healthy church, Karl?
Yeah, that's another one of those things. Defining a small church and defining a healthy church is a bit of a moving target. I've actually, the article that I'll be putting out as we are putting this together on a Thursday, the article I'll be putting out tonight for Friday. So by the time this is out, the article will be out, which, let me take a look at a title of it here so that we've got the title accurately. At least, how do you define a healthy church aside from the numbers? So if you look for the article that came out on July 23rd, which will be tomorrow as we record this, and I'm putting that out. And what I've got in there is I've actually listed 28 non-numerical signs of a healthy church. Let me give you a couple of them. People care more about doing ministry than having a title. There are more ministry teams than committees. Volunteerism is high. Guests feel welcome. The bulletin isn't just about internal events. New leadership is embraced. Long-time leadership is respected. Congregation members love each other, and congregation members like each other. There's 28 of them there. But what I've actually done is I've taken those and I've actually boiled them down, and I'm working right now on a survey, and I'm gonna give it to you so you guys can put it in the chat when this goes live. But I've actually created a survey called the Church Health Survey, and it takes 4 different major categories, and then it gives you 4 ways of assessing your church within those 4 major categories. And where did that go here? There we go. So the main categories are theology, mission, leadership, and attitude. And then under each of those, so under theology, it makes 4 statements about theology that you can answer, yes, we do this well, or no, we do this badly. And as an example, so under theology, the first question is about Bible. And the statement is, the eternal truths of the Bible are taught well and applied to our lives in practical ways. And you can answer that all the way from not at all to always. The second one is worship. Worship through song, prayer, and action is an essential focus of our congregation, not at all or all the way to always. And then under those other categories, so 16 questions, you can literally fill the thing out in about 2 minutes. And it will give you, basically what it'll give you is a couple categories that you may not have been considering. Oh, we don't do that particularly well. And that really is an essential element of a healthy church. So let's start looking at that. So I have it in beta mode right now, which again, I'll give to you so you can put in the chat for your folks. And we are working, hopefully by the end of the year, we want to create a robust assessment tool that then after you get it, you can go to resources that will help you strengthen those particular areas of weakness. And eventually what we want to do is we want to be able to, you can give this to everybody in your congregation where they can take 2 minutes, even in the middle of a service, fill out a simple thing, and then you can get back from them. And then you can look at it and go, oh, our leadership thinks we're doing this well, but not that well. But the congregation thinks we're doing that well, but not this well. And you can begin to assess, and none of it is numerical. It's the tagline is it's fast, it's free, and it's not about numbers. So we are working on that right now. It's part of the process of pulling things together. And it turns out that creating a survey that is robust and that every church can do for themselves costs a ton of money.
Time and money. Yep.
Oh my, the first bid we got was $12,000 to put this assessment tool together. And we went, okay, we're going to have to figure out some other way.
Zeros. How hard can it be? You know?
I know, right?
Yeah.
So anyway,
we're the numerical.
What's that?
They're too caught up in the numerical, Karl.
There we go. Yeah. Hi, this is not about numbers. Just do this for the Lord and for us and give it to us for free.
Well, I tell you, you've piqued my interest. I am ready to see that survey and the results of that, because you are talking a language that our tribe has been talking for a while. And in 2020, PJ, to answer your question, I wrote, the watershed principle. And really what it is, it identifies the 6 main streams of the church that need to be healthy for the church to be healthy. So we talk about balance, and not 50-50 balance, but that there's an emphasis on multiple layers in the church. Yeah. And that would push back against the church that says the only thing that's important is small groups, or the only thing that's important is worship. The second layer was reach, which would be evangelism, the doing part of seeing people come to Christ. Teach was the third layer, just that the word never returns void. And if we want to be able to handle the word of God effectively, we think it's a good steward to learn how to teach effectively, to teach well, and let that become a passion if it's not already. The next layer was serve, and the idea that our faith needs an outlet. And if not, we become stagnant. Like the Dead Sea's not dead because there's not fresh water flowing in. It doesn't have an outlet for it. That next layer was multiply. And this is, in my opinion, the greatest failure of the Southern Baptist Convention in my lifetime, which is we have failed to replicate who we are as disciples of Jesus Christ. We've seen 7.1 million people baptized with 0 increase in attendance. So that's a layer. And then the 6th layer was lead. And I've learned, that most pastors, Karl, they're not visionaries, they're middle managers, and they need help with learning how to lead effectively. They can't come up with that great big process, but if they can figure out how to be healthy, if they can figure out what some of those nuggets of some of those markers are, then they can work it out. And PJ, just to maybe be specific with your question, let me give 3 initial questions that I ask when churches call me and say, hey, would you just help us try to figure out, are we healthy or not? Can we become more healthy? Here are 3 questions that I like to ask. First one is this: does the church have an intentional plan to make disciples? And what does that look like? And what I've found is that people say, oh, yeah, we want to make disciples. And we send them to Sunday school. Well, our problem with that is the last 40 years have showed us that Sunday school is a very effective tool. Life groups, whatever you call that, is an effective tool. But that alone is not enough. It's not discipling our people. That's what the history has shown us. A second question that I ask folks to consider is a real practical one. Is the small group to worship ratio at or closing in on 75%? Now, a lot of times I'll say that to people and they're like, oh my gosh, man, we'll never get to that. Well, I guess I want it to be a target as well for a lot, but I do know that the churches that I'm studying in Georgia that are healthy, that are growing, that are trying to make disciples, that multiply, trying to follow a biblical model, they are running in that 65 to 85 and above. I'll give you an example. When I was in Houghton before I left, we actually had 4 Sundays in January and December of that year where we ran more people in our group system on Sunday morning than we did in worship. And both were growing. So it is possible, and that's a great question to ask. And here's the third one. Does abounding love characterize the church within the body and in the community? And what I'm finding with a lot of times, churches that are not healthy, the community doesn't even know they exist. Abounding love is not the character of that church. Now, folks, if any of you would like to know any more about the Watershed Principle, we've got that uploaded to YouTube. If you go to Georgia Baptist Discipleship, you can see all of that. YouTube, also on our Georgia Baptist Discipleship Facebook group. Now, Karl, as we close this thing out, where can people find Small Church Essentials, and where can they find that you on social media?
Yeah, if you can spell my name right, you can find me anywhere. KarlVaters.com, Karl Vaters at Twitter, on Instagram, Karl Vaters Ministry at Facebook. And I've got a podcast called Can This Work in a Small Church? We just put out episode 8, so we're still fairly new, but we've got some really great guests coming up on that as well. So yeah, spell my name right. You can find me anywhere. And
that is Karl with a K.
There we go.
There we go. Hey friends, let's close this out. Jimmy Draper once was quoted as saying, maximize this opportunity of a lifetime while you're in the lifetime of your opportunity. And I would say yes 1,000 times to that, because we are in a lifetime of opportunity right now. Backside of pandemic, people are asking new questions. They're thinking big thoughts, and we've got more grace than ever to make the needed changes that we need to make. And I pray that this discussion will help you. I hope you'll connect with Karl and that what he's doing will help you if you're in a small church. But I also hope that if this was helpful, please share the broadcast. And we hope that you'll apply that as well. PJ Dunn, thanks for being on here as well. You are a wealth of knowledge, wisdom, a great friend, and the absolute king of discipleship down in Southwest Georgia. Thank you for being on. And Karl Vaters, we appreciate you as well. Thanks for sharing your decades of wisdom and experience with our tribe. And thank you, Georgia Baptist Discipleship family, for engaging. And I pray that you'll keep multiplying disciples, multiplying churches, and multiplying groups as we seek to make world-impacting disciple makers.
Thank you for listening, and we want to give you a gift, the 5 discipleship shifts most churches need to make to produce world-impacting disciple makers. You can get this by going to ministryboom.com. That's ministryboom.com. This 5-page PDF is a discipleship alignment checklist that may surprise you. It will help you learn why programs are killing your discipleship, the #1 default worker strategy that keeps churches from empowering their ministries. Learn the OGV factor and how it can revolutionize discipleship, attendance, and evangelism in your church. Again, go to ministryboom.com. The Georgia Baptist Mission Board is able to provide resources like this because of gifts from Georgia Baptist to the Cooperative program. For more information on this broadcast and a customized discipleship plan for your church, visit gabaptist.org/discipleship. And by the way, if you found this content helpful, we sure hope you'll share it with a friend. And thanks so much for partnering with us to make world-impacting disciple makers.